Mr. Rowan Watson. I'm the Assistant Curator for Art here at the University of St Andrews, and we're here today to talk about the first of a series of events, as Ross says, to celebrate the opening of our new exhibition that opened last week, From These Parts, Scotland, Art and Identity. And it's very much Scotland, Art and Identity will be the key themes in our conversation this afternoon. I'm delighted to have with us our three speakers, with Eòghann, Cat and Ken here. Before we get into opening our conversation with some opening questions, I'd like to invite our speakers to introduce themselves. So starting, Eòghann, with yourself. Who are you? Where are you from? What do you do?
Hello, it's Eòghann. MacColl is an artist. Do a multitude of other things to support my practice. I'm Ayrshire based. My family are half Ayrshire and half Argyll. Broadly speaking, there's other places involved in those dynamics, but I've been living and based in Ayrshire for quite a long time now, which I regard as very much my home and feel very based there.
I am Dr Cat Dunn. I'm from Glasgow. I've been there for about 24 years. I'm a cultural curator, which means that I really look at social justice practices, and I tend to look at transatlantic slavery a lot. Because I think that there's still a lot that we can learn from that. My last exhibition was Crafted Selves here in St Andrews Museum. It then went on to Kirkbody 5 and Gracefield Galleries in Dunfield. And I'm currently working with Historic Environment Scotland on creating an exhibition for them that will open in April next year. Thank you.
My name's Kenneth Dingwall. I have been painting and making drawings and constructions and prints for a very long time. In fact, I've got a retrospective of 60 years of abstract work for coming up at the City Arts Centre, and a book coming out next year. I come from Clackmannanshire, and I remember coming from Clackmannanshire with a book that I had as my school art prize to go to Edinburgh College of Art. And the book was on David Allen, the Scottish genre painter. And the book was written by the Reverend Gordon from Clackmannan. And I thought, God, this is great, we'll be in Edinburgh, and there'll be tons of books to see about Scottish painting. I wasn't the one in Finn's bookstore when I went there. And I went to an art school with magazines from France primarily, and from London, and there were no Scottish art magazines either. So I got a little bit of bias.
I'm going to start with first. We've got three big questions I want to ask over the course of the next 30 minutes or so. I'm going to start, no less where you are. I'm going to start with you, but I'll pass it on to our other speakers. On identity and your art practice, how does your identity, Scottish or otherwise, influence your work?
Well, so infinitely in every way it influences my work and practice. I studied in Duncan College of Art and Design, Dr Cat, back in the day. I was graduating in 1992 from the Fine Art department there. I had fantastic tutors in college and loved art school. In terms of my own family background, I was born in Inverness, and as I said, my mother's family are from Ayrshire. Although my great-grandfather came from Kintyre, so that Western Seaboard part of my life was always in my background. I used to go and visit Highland families in Kinlochleven and places like that where my dad was brought up, and that all influenced me as a person. And folk music's always been big in my family. Parents had their honeymoon in Dublin, and we were always aware of Gaelic and of that part of my own background. But like many people with a Gaelic background, it was never something that was openly shared or talked about or promoted or even acknowledged in some ways. And to get on and to progress, you would hear, like my great aunties would talk to each other in the kitchen in Gaelic, and they would be using Gaelic, but whereas my grandfather, who became a doctor, GP, and his brother, who became a head teacher, they kind of, that's not for them, because they were going to get on and they were going to progress. And my aunties, who stayed at home and worked in the factory, and that kind of narrative was theirs. So, you know, that whole contextualizing of our own culture and a big chunk of my personal family culture is very common, and you'll meet many people. You know, my children went to Gaelic Medium Primary School, particularly my daughter. My boys didn't do so much of that, but they did go for a period, but we moved house, and there was different reasons why that changed. But it's interesting talking to their families who come from you know, who have a Highland connection or a Highland heritage connection, that they, you know, you would hear the same thing, or you would meet people from the Highlands or Islands who wouldn't even know that they could speak Gaelic because they wouldn't use it, because it was like, well, why would I use it? Yeah. And thankfully we've got to some kind of point where we can nearly acknowledge the fact that it might be a thing that we can be proud of. And that's I suppose, I was saying to you there just before we started, I did a master's in Winchester School of Art, which I did that essentially because it was in Barcelona, and I went and spent 9 months in Barcelona, which obviously was fantastic in every single way, you know, artistically, culturally, politically, geopolitically. All of those things really resonated with me, and that kind of inspired me to really re-engage with that part of my own culture and my own identity, which I've done to a large extent, and it continues to carry on through my practice, and through not just my practice, everything I do and everything, all my kind of core beliefs are engaged and entangled with that. And I think that's really, you know, I think we all have to be aware of where we come from and who we are, and celebrate those things, and not feel ashamed of that. And I think, you know, because of our histories and Scottish and Gaelic and Highland history, there's a, you know, there is a shaming of it. There's been, you know, you're not going to get on if you do that, and you're not going to be able to be the best person that you can be in our world if you follow those pathways, and there's rich and deep reasons for that. And, you know, thankfully we're getting to a point where we can start to talk about these things and unpick some of this and think, well, wait a minute, why is this? Why do we have this shame about a language and a way of looking at the world and a way of feeling and being? You know, all these things are so important, and, you know, we desperately need to cling on to that, all these human stories and narratives, and celebrate them, and you know, yeah, I mean, I could go on and on in this one, so I'm conscious of maybe trying to wrap up. But it's interesting, you know, Catherine Connolly just became the new president of Ireland, and she has taken a very beautiful and natural and female stance on how you look at your culture and who you are and where you come from, and that feels really resonates in these times for me, because, you know, there's lots of dark forces out there who really are working algorithms and all of that. And she just came along in this beautiful, sincere, quiet and passionate and positive way, and has offered another choice, and has offered us all a wee bit of hope. And you know, I think as a Gael and as a Gaelic speaker, you know, we have strong connections with Ireland because of the language and the culture and the history, even though our cultures and histories are slightly different, of course, because we're different places, but the connections are deep and run deep. And you know, so it's nice to know that there's a bit of hope out there. Because things are tricky for us all at this time, I think.
It's quite interesting that the idea of Gaelic, you're not going to get by as long as there's a block, historically speaking, that if you had Gaelic, that wasn't your way to get through, but whether that was in the visual arts, academia, or in medicine as well.
Yeah, all of those things. And I remember doing a project in the Glasgow, and with one of the teachers who was, her dad was an eminent scholar in Gaelic, and she couldn't speak Gaelic herself, but yet because he did his scholarly activities when the kids were sleeping, and it's like that whole, imagine how that kind of, the burden of that, you know, not being able to be who you are for genetic, when people spoke Gaelic for forever, you know, it's that kind of, the breaking of that is you know, that's traumatic, it's deep, and it's, you know, we're trying to put some of that back together again, and that's not easy.
I'm sure we'll come back to that in a future question, but I'll pass it on to Cat. Cat, your identity, how that influences your practice.
My identity is very much dual. So I was born in Barbados. I grew up in Barbados. Now I lived in Scotland, and actually I was saying to my husband, I've not lived in Scotland longer than being a child in Barbados, because my grandmother kicked me off the island at 17 to go to university. But again, it's very different because we are taught a very different history. You know, at 5, I was put on a bus. We went to, at 4, I knew I wanted to be a curator. I guess I should say that, because I went to the museum, Barbados Museum, and there's this lady who locked us in the only surviving slave hut. 4-year-old me did not like that at all. And we were crammed in there with like 20 something other people. And that was the reality of what the enslaved people went through. But you grew up in Barbados and you obviously have all the enslaved plantations, still as plantations. Today, for instance, we are still fighting with the Drax family, who own this massive plantation in St. George, and they're refusing to give it back to the people of Barbados. And yet one of them is an MSP for the Tories, so that says everything I need to know, really. But you're put on buses and you're taken to like the Newton Plantation burial grounds. The little girl, you're stepping out on the mounds and graves of the enslaved people. Going back as an adult and doing that same journey is very, very different, because as a child, you're literally like, why are they hills? Like, you're skipping around. As an adult, you're going back and understanding these are the graves of enslaved people who were just hundreds of them tossed into these different holes and covered over. And yet again, the Newton plantation, the Newton family is fighting with the Barbados government about being able to rebury these people properly. So you have aspects like that, but we also grew up learning all of the stories. You grew up learning all of the history, but we're also taught the languages of the Arawaks, the Caribs, the Garifuna, all these indigenous people that were there before us that were brutally murdered. And now it's coming to a point again where the Garifuna are beginning to slowly but surely descendants come back out and populate. But I think in terms of identity, for me, I fight against, I feel like I'm doing this all the time because, again, growing up in the Caribbean, growing up in a Black family, you were told, artists, no, don't be stupid. You're going to be a doctor, a lawyer, a business person, end the story. That is it, you know. And so I find it very interesting now because I'm an artist and a doctor, and I'm like, how does that work? It's not the same thing. And so, yeah, this idea of having dual identity means that I kind of have one foot sitting in the West Indies or the Caribbean, one foot constantly sitting in Scotland. And so that gives me this kind of creolized view of Scotland. I think that in terms of history, I've read Scottish history books and I just laughed and I'm like, where's the rest of it? You know, or living in Glasgow where, you know, you've got Broomielaw, you've got the Clyde, you've got all the Merchant City, you've got all these streets and houses named after, you know, plantation owners and tobacco lords. You're thinking, where's the connection? So for me, it's very much about being able to research and isolate like these little moments and then try to pull them apart and tear them apart, such as right now, doing work and looking at the 5 coasts and that involvement with transatlantic slavery, because people don't think about that. They think that the transatlantic slave code came, you know, from England, from London. And yes, that is true, but Scotland also benefited. And I think as part of being Scottish, because I consider myself to be Bajan Scottish, I am not here to like dump water on or point fingers. I literally am here to try and do the research and then work out and then give you the story in the form of an exhibition or a seminar or a workshop, whatever it might be. And for you to then go and do your own research. I am not Google. I don't have all the answers. But what I can do is to tell you from someone who has, I guess, both feet in both countries.
So very thoughtful, the idea of walking through Glasgow and seeing the signposts and seeing those names. And so it's in one way it's a connection, but other ways it's such a disconnect from realities.
But yeah, I think that especially this became very true in, obviously we had COVID and everybody was locked up. But then in November 2021, Barbados became a republic. And, you know, on the day, of course, I couldn't be in Barbados. I was in Scotland and we were still kind of locked down, but I went on a walk, you know, through the Broomielaw, through Merchant City, and you're looking at houses and you're looking at names and you're going like, oh, well, yeah, this refers back to this place in Barbados, Jamaica, Suriname, wherever. But then there's nothing to tell you that. And I think that that's the thing that I more importantly would like to try to nudge or change, because in Barbados, there are great big signs, like they're not tiny, they're massive, saying, you know, this church was built on like 110,000 pounds of sugar, you know, for the slave, these, you know, plantation owners and so on and so forth. You don't have that here. And I think that then becomes the disconnect. And so when you then say to people, Scotland is a creolized land, people look at you and go like, we don't know what you're talking about. But of course you do, because it's not traditional white, blue-eyed, blonde-eyed, you know, Scottish, you know, you have people from the Highlands who went over to the Caribbean. You have people, immigrants who come into Scotland and change it and make it their own. So I think that, you know, we now have to look at Scotland as it's moving forward. It is definitely a creolized land, and yet there are quite a lot of people, especially at the moment, who I feel for every tiny step that we take forward, they're trying to drag us 30 years into the past. And so that then becomes a difficult thing, because you then have to start weighing up, you know, is it worth continuing the fight? But then I always kind of think, if I don't do the fight, then it's just going to be a little bit harder.
Yeah. Your identity and how that influences your artistic practice.
Well, I think of myself as Scottish, but I don't do a lot of thinking about myself as I just assume that it's there. I assume that it's there living in Edinburgh, where if we're looking at history, we've got streets like Hanover Street and Dundas Street, all a whole host of names, all established after the 45 revolution, with the Scottish Enlightenment deciding they had to show that they were on the side of the Presbyterian Hanovers and not the Catholic Jacobites. And yet history, I've got a note in one of my sketchbooks by Iris Murdoch saying, we've got to do something about the past that keeps interfering with the future. And I think that, in a sense, we live in Scotland, where, as an artist, I'm acutely conscious. I've got friends who are art historians like Mother MacDonald and Duncan Macmillan, who wrote very good histories of Scottish art. But in a way, I think, as with all history, it's partially mythic. They were writing at a time which had a big gap in any history survey of what Scottish art was, after a cluster of novels in the 19th century. The most important one was a guy, James Call, who went on to be the director of the Scottish National Gallery. And he writes with an absolute fervour about Scottishness and Scottish art. And yet Scottish art was only identified in Europe in the late 1880s by a German art historian who wrote A Modern History of European Art. And he devoted a chapter to Whistler and the Scotch. And that was the first time that we'd been identified as a separate entity from British art. And in the subsequent histories, the cause is very, very pro-Scottish, terribly behind the artist sort of thing. But in a kind of way, he's also not got very much to say. In fact, it's quite sneering about the very young J.D. Ferguson and the very young Peplin, who both, after that book, went off to Paris. Because they were obviously in slavery for months with the principal critic for the Scotsman. I think that the histories that we have of the Scottish art history are ones which were designed at a point at the turn of the century when across the world was changing in gigantic ways. I mean, I think it's hard to put ourselves, maybe just a little bit we can, with the coming of artificial intelligence, but at the end of the 19th and just into the beginning of the 20th century, the kind of developments that were made in things like flight, physics, the idea of social anthropology, the idea that at that point, suddenly, instead of a minority of men and no women having a vote, a large percentage of people actually had a say in voting. I mean, it's quite extraordinary how narrow and controlled our history is. And I think, in a way, when you're examining our art history, the history we're examining is one which came through London. The Scottish artists were in art history if they were resident in London and exhibiting in London. I mean, I can remember clearly I've got works on the Scottish National Gallery of Modern Art. The first one was bought because I had a show in the Mayor Gallery and the Gallery. Absolutely that. At the same time, I had a show on in Edinburgh in a Scottish gallery, and they bought from the London Gallery, not the Scottish Gallery. Scottish art history was designed to establish the fact that we did have a history, that we did have traits and qualities and characteristics that, just as Kat's saying, that exist in society, that are held there. And yet, the kind of writing that was done was one that perhaps lauded things that didn't really happen properly. If you look at the show downstairs, one of the first works you'll see when you're on the end wall when you move in, is a guy, William McCants, who was in Glasgow. And William McCants was hailed maybe a decade or maybe 15 years back, maybe even 20 years back, as someone who was one of the first people to make abstract paintings from Scotland. Well, McCants left Scotland immediately after he graduated from the Glasgow School of Art, and he went down to London. And he got a reception there because vorticism had suddenly come into being, and vorticism had an enormous amount of publicity because the Italians in the Futurist movement had created a platform for vorticism. We have histories where we discuss the idea that William Johnson is an important figure in the modernist movement in Scottish painting. William Johnson went to Edinburgh College of Art, then studied with André Lotte in France, and then came back and painted for 1 year in Scotland, and nobody was interested in what he did. He went down to London. I went to Edinburgh College of Art, and the period I was there, I had people who were marvellously generous and supportive, William Gillis, Johnny Maxwell, Robin Phillipson. But I also went there when there was no gallery of modern art in existence. So in Edinburgh, though I could see shows in the Academy and the SSA and the few private galleries that were there, there was no gallery that showed a history of painting. The only history of painting was contained in the National Gallery, which was founded in the 1830s. And when it was founded after the National Gallery in London and after the Irish National Gallery. Both of these, when they were founded, were given bequests to buy new art. When the Scottish National Gallery was founded, there was no bequest to buy art. So the only way the Scottish Gallery moved, and it moved very slowly, was by gifts from the public. And when the Scottish Gallery of Modern Art was founded, it was founded in the home of the Botanics Gardens director, who happened to be a friend of Gillis and Maxwell and was supportive of Scottish art. So he leaned on this idea that you could use this little converted house. And it was founded with one curator. He didn't even have a desk to himself in the Scottish National Gallery's office, and a tiny, tiny budget. The budget was so tiny that it couldn't afford the prices and values of modern art that could have been bought in 1910, 1912, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. In the 1960s, the prices had escalated. One of the reasons why the Scottish colourists are of interest is that I can remember a dealer coming. I was living in New York at the time, staying in somebody else's loft, and the guy had been in Boston trying to put on a show, but lost an artist there, and it had fallen through. And he was broke. And he came and stayed with us for a couple of days and went back. And then I went to the Chicago Art Fair the next year. And he had 2 stalls showing Scottish work. And I said, what happened? You were bankrupt. And he said, oh, I sold a J.D. Ferguson. And J.D. Ferguson virtually overnight went from being a parochial figure to being an international figure, because they suddenly discovered that virtually no Fauvist paintings, which was the basis of the Scottish colourist movement, that no Fauvist paintings were on the market. They were all in museums that private collectors weren't selling. There was no viability for them. So suddenly the Danes and the Scots who had been in Paris, some of them studying with Matisse, suddenly became Fauvists, and their prices escalated. I don't think I'll keep going on just now. I'll pick up again. The theme again.
Yeah, I think there's a constant pull of Scottish artists to London, to Paris,
Oh,
and artistic centres, or
yeah.
not just sort of creative centres, but fiscal and economic sense
Yes.
as well. You know, that's
And as a result, we have a history that it says, you know, that we were part of the modernist movement. And yet the modernist movement that we followed through was really rather a decorative one. It really had very few interests that were acknowledged. It wasn't the artists didn't acknowledge it. I mean, Scottish artists have always travelled, have always been cosmopolitan. It's just there was no educated public.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll go into the second question here. I'm going to start with Cat on this one. Now, we actually talked about this briefly when we came into the exhibition. The exhibition title, From These Parts, comes from Jackie Cave's poem. Thinking from these parts being places, localities, materials or objects, what do you think, what does from these parts mean to you and your practice in you?
Thanks. Well, if I can start with, for instance, Model Salter, which is in the exhibition downstairs, incredible. When I saw Model Salter, like, I think those images like 4 years ago when I first came to St. Andrews doing some in the museum archives doing some research. Two things struck me on that visit. Thing one was obviously seeing this absolutely massive, incredible painting of Maud Salter with her mom. And I was accompanied on that visit by Dr. Alberta Whittle. And before I could say anything, Dr. Whittle literally said, "Oh my gosh, it could be you at home with your grandmother." And that was like one of the things that really struck me was the fact that material culture is so interesting, because here was, you know, Maud Salter as a little girl with her mom, but she was dressed the exact same way that I was forced to dress for like Sunday school and Sunday church. And in Barbados, on Saturdays, is an interesting thing in local households, because you'll hear a lot of children screaming. And it's because it's the washing your hair and looking after your hair is like seen as a chore. So we've got, this is my hair now, but my hair then was this massive afro that just kind of bounced with me. And so it was like kind of watching like a matchstick coming towards you, tiny little body, lots of hair. And so on Saturday mornings, it was kind of like, you know, have breakfast, clean the house, you do your chores, your hair getting done. And that's where I would start to run. And so it's also the day that you were allowed to go in the sea and wet your hair, except that nobody told them that salt water makes afro hair harder. Yeah. So this is why we were then told the stories to try to detract you from the pulling and the tugging. And as a little girl, I was like, why can it not just be me? Like, leave me alone, you know? But actually, as I grew up, I understood that it was so that we would just be seen as humans and not as othered. And so there's a story that goes with that. I was a little girl, I was with my grandmother. It was like our weekends, and she was taking to all these art practices, even though we kind of knew that it's not supposed to happen secretly. And these tourists were in Barbados, and this, I will never forget, this white woman just came beelining over from my afro, plunged her hands into my hair and started talking about, oh my God, it doesn't feel the way I thought it would feel. And I am literally like, please get off of me, you know. And my grandmother was literally like, please remove your hands off the child. And I was like, why is Grammy not getting angry? Like, get her something, like, get me out of here. But I realized that my grandmother couldn't be seen as the angry Black woman, and she couldn't be seen as othered. Whereas I was reduced from being me, this happy child, to this thing for this person's amusement. And it was almost like they brought tickets to the island, and I was therefore part of what they bought tickets for. And then I thought, okay, the torture's gone on long enough. I'm squirming. And the woman calls her friends over, and I will never forget this. They were eating pineapple, and the juice was like running down their hands, and they too came over. And I'm like, my hair just got washed. Like, what? But I kind of got my way back because I'm really stubborn. As I walked away, I remember I said, lady, when you all go, they make us take our clothes off. We have to go live in the trees. And that was just me trying to reclaim me at that moment. Now, my grandmother was like, you can't say that. But then I heard her speaking to my mother and saying, I'm so proud of her. Yes. But again, it was this moment of seeing. So when I looked at that image, all of these things came flooding back. This memory, really strong memory, but also of being forced to wear lace hats in 34-degree heat, of having to wear lace gloves. And then I realized again, as I was going older, especially as I do more and more of this work, the idea of the lace gloves were if you worked in the sugarcane field, or if you worked in any kind of manual field, if you were a housekeeper or whatever, the gloves were a nod to British Victoriana, but they're also a way of hiding your status in life. So you have gloves on, nobody can see that your hands are stained with green from the sugar cane or been scrubbed to death, or you've got calluses or whatever. So everybody wore hats and gloves. I tried to escape that as quickly as I could. But then coming here now, especially with the work that I'm doing, this idea of place and space for me is really important. So when you look at, for instance, the different coastal routes and the highlands, for instance, you've got materials, excuse me. You've got materials going from, say, Kirkcaldy, which was linen, being shipped over to the West Indies, which were then used to clothe the slaves. This material then came back as bags for sugarcane. And then it was refurbished and it was put into the padding of sofas and seats going up to the highlands. So you've got this interesting generation, but also with the Teagan law happening. I don't know if you guys know the Teagan law was basically created by white women in South Carolina because they decided that Black women on our here were taking their men away from them. And so the governor made a law, that the Teagan law, that you had, if you're a Black woman, you had to tie your hair. Black women being Black women, we just took that and turned it into fashion. But then this traversed back into the West Indies. And so the women who were enslaved didn't have a way of dealing with their Afro hair. And so what they did was any offcuts again of like pigs, etc., they would boil it down and they would use that grease to help oil their hair. What they did with these bits of material, linen, the same thing that they were dressed in, was they would soak it in flowers to get the scent. And then that would be dried and used to wrap their hair so you couldn't smell the rancid pig grease that's in their hair. And so when you start to dig into these bits and pieces, it's not just a case of treating people as other or treating them as animals. It's a way of people finding a way to survive and rebelling, and to the point where maps would be woven into our hair. There would be messages woven in through cornrows and braids so that each plantation would know what was going on without the owners knowing, because they wouldn't let us play drums, and drums was one of the ways that we had to send messages. So we had to get smarter, so so that they couldn't see what was going on, you wrap your hair. So again, the head tie, which we still wear today, is twofold. And so to be able to link that back to factories from Kirkcaldy or factories with jute from the Highlands, and realize that actually there's this give and take of material culture, which actually tells its own story. For me, it's really important when we think of places and spaces and people, because you now have a body of artists, Dr. Alberto Bitto, Ashanti Harris, you've got like Sakai Machachi, all these like Josie Ko, etc., who are all in the exhibition downstairs, but we all come with a different narrative. And this is where I again go back to this idea of place and space being this cultural moment, because I can sit and I can go like, okay, so material came from here, it went there, it clothed them, it was used as head ties, it was then discarded and used as sacks. The sacks then came back here, and then once it got here, they're like, what are we supposed to do with these? Oh, we know, we'll pad the seats, which then goes up to these great houses in the Highlands. And so you're then watching that there's like this idea of almost a triangle between enslaved people and Scottish coastlands. And for me, that's like really important, because we have a moment in time where I get asked pretty much every day, day on, day off. It's now my most hated question to answer. Where are you from? And it doesn't, and I normally go subside of Glasgow. And they go like, no, but where are you from? Scotland. No, but where are you really, where's your grandparents from? Well, I'm mixed race. So again, where you want me to go with this? You know, but the idea of them, oh, my mother, my father in Barbados. Okay, yeah. Then that goes into, why are you here? And so it's like, oh, are you here for school? I get things like, oh, so you're married. Oh, so your husband met you over there. No. You know, and so it's this mindset of, oh, why are you here? You must have a reason to be here. And when the reason is finished, why are you still here? And so again, when you think about place and space, I regard Scotland as my home. I've been here for 24 years. My friends are here, my husband is here, my family is here. But every single day, without fail, I get asked that question.
It's the same question that Jackie Kay got asked.
Yes, exactly.
And with the response to these parts, and it's wonderful to hear how you've interpreted that as being parts of Scotland, material, cultural-wise, and place as well. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
You're from these parts.
Yeah.
What does that mean to you?
I'm thinking back on how we frame, you know, Scottish art, and I'm thinking about the cup and ring, the Neolithic, and I'm thinking about Stanley Stones, and I'm thinking about, I've had a long fascination with the Neolithic, which is a worldwide phenomenon actually, funnily enough, because we are all humans and we all inhabit the same planet, and we all connect and have been connecting for a very long time. But you know, when you visit, there's a fantastic cup and ring place drawing in Ballochmyle in Ayrshire, right, which is, it's not that well known because everyone assumes it's going to be in the Highlands and it's going to be because it's Scotland that bit. But this one's actually in rural Ayrshire, and it's fabulous. But I quite often, I pass it often when I stop to see it. But I mean, we know all the famous ones, and I've been in many of them. And there's a sense of place in these, and there's a sense of human engagement, and you really sense that people have been in these places and have worked them, and there's obviously clear reasons for this. What they are, you know, is a big question. My great grandfather was a chap called Alexander Thom, and he did a whole lot of study on astroastronomy, and was kind of poo-pooed for a long time in some senses, and some of his theories still are a little bit poo-pooed, but he also was recognised because he did a lot of spade work and a lot of research on the ground in these places. So through my family, I had a connection with that world, and it's really that thing about place and space. It's, you know, if you spend time in a place and you know it seasonally, you know, over a period of time, you become attuned to it and akin to it, and you know, in Gaelic we talk about dúchas, and that's the thing about being fully aware of where you're from, and humans are not any different from other living beings. That's the way the Gael looks at the world. So when the pandemic came along and we were stuck, I live in an old farm type setting, which was in my family, still in my family, and I kind of used that as my boundaries, and I started to make walking drawings. I walked to the compass points. That's how I did it. And I thought the whole piece would be about boundary and barrier, but in actual fact, it became about the walking, and it became about the experiences. And I'm still doing it. I was out last night, in fact, because I do it specific. I do it celestial times, and I do it when there's full moons. And we had the end of British summertime last night, so you lose an hour. So a couple of years ago, I tried to do that. I went out and tried to draw that hour that disappeared, because I kind of love that idea that, you know, somebody else is telling us that this is when the summertime ends, and this is when you will have to become a winter person now, and this is what it looks like from where we are, the news from where we are. So I was out last night drawing again, and I do it periodically, and I walk the same pathways and I walk the same routes. You become very aware at different points in the year where the robins are fighting with each other. We've got hare around us, which I love, because the hare just appear at the funniest times when you never expect them to be there, but they're always around. We've also got cows. You know, I'm living in Ayrshire, and dairy and that heritage and history of Ayrshire is huge. So we still have cows around about us. The other thing is the cows have their own pathways. So they have the paths that they walk, and they have done for generations. And so that becomes a lovely thing too. There's a fabulous Gaelic word for it, road, boar, which is literally the cow's way. And I became obsessed with that way of looking at place, you know, that experience of being, you know, thinking about the Neolithic, thinking about the fact that we can, you know, I know where the sun sets at the lowest point of just below Pladder, and then at the high point in the summer, it's at the top end of Kilburn Hills, and I can watch that and be aware of that. The climate and the weather means you quite often can't see any of that stuff. But over time and over a lifetime, you start to reattune with that, and you become aware of it, and you become aware that, you know, the moon's there again. It was there last year at this time, and those things which as a child and as a human, you kind of notice these things often, but then you maybe don't pay much take much notice of those things. But then as a visual artist and as a creative person, I suppose I thought, man, this is really fascinating me. And lockdown gave me that time to really walk into all of that stuff in my practice in ways that I'd peripherally done. My piece downstairs is an image of the Faroe Islands, and that was from a Saracen scholarship that I was lucky enough to win and to go on. And that whole thing again about how you look at place and perspective comes up through that, because it was a very conscious decision for me to travel north and to leave Scotland by going north, because we're not supposed to do that, and yet we have all these connections with the north and all of these communities who've been coming all around here all the time. And Faroe was phenomenal for that. So yeah, I think it's about having an awareness of your place and how you maybe we all struggle and bump along to try and fit into things in multi-identity with multiple identities in different ways. And it's about acknowledging the fact that we have to be able to acknowledge that there are different ways of looking and seeing and being in a place. Again, you think about the environmental things. I measure the rain. I keep the rain every month that we have. And in a way, again, that was a family connection. My late uncle started it when he was a schoolboy, and my family still collect the rain, and it's done through CPAP, and it's an official weather station. So I'm now gathering the rain in bottles every month to see how the rain is changing, because it is changing. We're getting different rain patterns and different rainfall. And that's an environmental concern. You have all that interest about how the land is managed and used, and agriculture is declining, and small scale farming is declining. So that has an impact on how the whole environment feels and looks. Nobody drains land anymore the way they used to at the height of agriculture when we were producing for the empire and all of that. So those things have changed, and I suppose it's about that measurement of time and space and place from the minutiae of it. Listening to the robins having a squabble in the spring, or to the watching the International Space Station going over and being aware that we're going to have a full moon at this point in the year, which I might go out and try and draw because it's quite good fun. But often you can't see it because it's cloudy. But you just have to trust that she's still there.
That's wonderful. I think what those two answers so far have shared, something about childhood memories comes up, that from these parts can mean the fragmentation of land or the fragmentation of time is a big thing here, and we can work in different ways. Ken, I'm interested to hear what you think from these parts maybe to you in terms of your work.
I'm just listening to my colleagues here. I was thinking about how much I enjoyed what was it called, the 184 Theatre Company. Can you remember the 184 Theatre? 784. 784 Company. It was an enormously progressive theatre company that took its title from the idea that 7% of the population owned 84% of the land. I don't know that the statistics are all that different up in the north at the present moment. And yet, we have these sensitive things of that, and we think of them as being ours and unique. And they are in a sense, but I just recently I went back to Kilmartin, seeing where after the Ice Age, the first people who stopped being wanderers settled down to farm. And that's where a lot of the cup and ring pieces are. And then during the festival, I went to the book festival with my wife, and she'd been reading Richard Flanagan's Question 7, was it? Question 7. I don't know if you've read that. I recommend it if you do. He's Tasmanian, and the book is a kind of collection of fragmented memories, and fragmented memories in the sort that his dad was probably Aboriginal, and thinking that his dad was probably Aboriginal, and it could only be through the woman's line, because the first settlers in Tasmania were so absolutely ruthless that it really was only the women's line that stayed on in that part of Australia. So he then made a mention of the kind of white domination, in the sense that the principal museum in Tasmania decided to go along to these old original settled lands and saw off some of the stone petroglyphs front faces and bring them back to Hobart Museum. And then there was a hue and cry about that from the rest of Australia. And they went back and put them back again. And in neither instance did they consult what the ghosts of an Aboriginal community. So I thought, I've never heard of these petroglyphs in Tasmania. And so I looked them up, and here are Coppin rings, almost identical to Kilmartin, probably in the same time basis. And I think one of the things that I find fascinating in my interest in prehistory, it stems from the fact that I said I went to Edinburgh College of Art and there was no National Gallery of Modern Art. So the very first place I saw abstract art was in the National Museum of Antiquities. And there I saw art from prehistory, the Picts, the Celts, and they were all jammed into one tiny little room in what used to be solely the portrait gallery. It's the Museum of Antiquities and the Portrait Gallery. And some of them were originals and some of them were casts. But it just bowled me over, lifting up the little covers and suddenly seeing these little figurative drawings or little abstract drawings, and that human beings had been able to communicate to each other through feeling as well as through the sort of Enlightenment's empirical sense of observation. And I think, in a sense, you know, we all, each and every day, our lives are controlled by sensations that we take in through our eye, if we're lucky enough to see, and get to our brain, and we have a reaction before any word is formed. I mean, that's proven scientifically. And that we all have instincts like, how close can I sit? I'm like, that's too intimate. A certain distance away, it's overbearing. And we operate by tiny sensations. All of those around us, we notice that their complexions change. We notice how their shoulders are indicating how they're feeling. We notice coming down to the corner of the mind. We live a myriad of sensations that are abstract, that we read them. And I think when we're going back to these Paleolithic and prehistory and primitive things, I don't think that there's anything primitive about it. I think that if you examine all the societies that we only started to become, the ordinary people, only started to become aware of, was when the colonial system started to bring back artifacts to 19th century museums of anthropology and art museums. If you think about it, we have an art history that runs from the Renaissance, but it didn't used to run from the Renaissance. It ran from the Renaissance, and then suddenly in the mid-20th century, we suddenly allowed the 1400s to come in, the Quattrocento. But prior to that, that had been regarded as primitive art. It wasn't about the mimetic art, which wanted to illustrate that artists could be up alongside philosophers and historians, and therefore art became something that was not sensory, that was not something that was shared. It became an art for an elite, and it was an art that principally thrived by making paintings that illustrated classical myths or chosen aspects of our history. Scottish painting became important in a European sense because Walter Scott became a rage in Europe, and hosts of painters across Europe painted Walter Scott paintings, illustrational paintings. Hosts of Scots did that. And we lost the whole thousands of years of prehistory of symbolic sensory art to a mimetic art that really was the trade guilds of the painters trying to jump on a horse and be intellectual and move away from the basic instincts that all of us make an art form from. I may be rattled with biases and rattled with theories and rattled with things that I respond to in art. But when I'm making something, the only damn thing that's happening is that I'm standing in front of it. I mean, it sounds ludicrous, but I've forgotten the name of an English art historian who talked about perhaps the most overlooked idea in art was that whatever you're doing, whether you're throwing a pot, or you're weaving, or you're painting a picture, you're carving sculpture, you're standing in front of the thing. You're standing in front of it and looking at it. And as you make it, it changes. And as you change it, it talks back to you. And that's a process that keeps on going on all the time. And so no matter how fantastic an idea I thought I was starting from, which is usually some sort of doodly drawing, I end up with something that I've never seen before. But in a way, all societies have started from those instincts. We're not, if I go to Kilmartin and you see that you've got little burial grounds, rocks stacked together, you'll find those across Europe. You'll find them from the Egyptians doing it.
It's a shared language.
A shared language. And I suppose the one thing that came out of colonialism and the setting up of museums was that artists suddenly became aware that that mimetic language wasn't the only damn language available. And we were seeing African art, and we were seeing Asian art from Pacific and so on, and seeing that there were all kinds of varying ways that you could communicate ideas.
Seems like we've gone through not just thinking of some of these parts from Scotland looking inwards, but
Yes.
it's here.
So we all love, we all weep, we all hurt.
To Australia and everywhere in between. I've got time for one more question. It's going to be I'm sorry for the perhaps the big question and a small answer. We'll go back to Eòghann here, looking to the future. So we've thought a lot about from recent history to ancient history, Paleolithic, Neolithic, and then to modern history. But looking to the future, from your perspective, how do you envision the future of Scottish art or art in Scotland? In a short questions.
I think the decolonisation and that whole narrative is huge and gives us a really great opportunity to make it more equitable and more understandable and even out all this terrible prejudices and let's not forget as Scots we played a pretty nasty part in some of this stuff too, and that's, I know Gaels did, the first president of Canada was a Gael who inflicted some terrible things upon the Indigenous communities of Canada. But I think the future, we have to be hopeful and we have to realise that we have an opportunity to realign narratives and to make them more widen them out and that universality of it. I think there's something I don't think you could accuse any of us of being parochial, but sometimes when we talk about Scotland, we're accused of being parochial, and it's only because we want Scotland to be an equal player in a global context, universal context, and I think that's a really important thing to say. The advent of AI and things like that means that I think creative people and the creative and the mark, as you say, when you stand in front of something and have that conversation with whatever it is, and it might even be ironically a device, but whether you're that whole piece seems more important now than ever because of the way the world is, the speed at which progress is gone. We have to just be mindful of that and try and listen to everybody as equally as we can.
Going to add on to that, I think collaboration is really important as we move forward. We're unfortunately in a moment in time where, as I said, people are trying to drag us back 30, 40, 50 years. And the only way that that's going to be combated is with collaboration. So museums, universities, they have to allow the people who can tell them different aspects of the story to come in. And not just at the moment, I think, especially in Scotland, there is this narrative of, oh, we can't have her in because, she's a freelance curator. Oh, she's going to take her job. Or, oh my gosh, I can't work with you. You're so political because you talk about identity. I have news for people. Identity is political for every single one of us. And so if you've got someone or a set of people who can give you a different narrative about, especially an archival material, then you bring them in, you work collaboratively with them, you figure out ways and means to tell both parts of the story, because at the end of the day, you're kind of addressing more than one audience. And that's something that people don't take into account. So I think that really needs to we need to kind of be hand in hand and be very firm in taking the next step forward, because if we're literally going to find ourselves dragged 50 years back.
Well, I'd imagine we'll wallow on much the same way.
Nice.
Struggling for money and, I mean, for the arts. And I think the one thing I'd want, you know, in the way I was saying that, you know, the growth of the idea of an art gallery and a museum is very slow. I mean, in Scotland, we first started having art auctions in the 1600s because we were emulating what the Dutch were doing. And that was coming from a society that was reasonably prosperous. And gradually, I don't know if any of you have read Murray Pittock's Scottish histories. He's got a marvelous book on Edinburgh's smart city. He's talking about it in the 1600s. And he's talking about how extraordinary cosmopolitan it was. He's talking about how many, what a large population of French people were living there because of the court of Mary Guise, or a large Dutch population there was because Scotland, in a weird way, had one of the largest aristocratic family heritages, probably from the clan system. But of course, there's so few of them could inherit anything. They all had to go into professions, and they went to Leiden in Holland for their university educations in accountancy or law or whatever, medicine. And he's saying that other aspects are fascinating from the 1500s. Well, the women ran hosts of businesses. Women retained their own names, not just on their gravestones as they do now. And the idea that, you know, in the 1600s, people were responding to that Renaissance idea that artists' drawings were things which showed their temperament and instinct. It started to collect artist drawings. And in that era, as in previous eras, but we don't know. We don't know if the Celts had drawings before they started their very elaborate carvings, because we've got a climate and nothing that was on paper or on canvas would endure through. But if you think about it, if you look at a Rembrandt sketch drawing, it's about a series of diagonal and angular forces. It's usually a bit of dark tone and a smudge with a thumb or something like that, and a bit of spit. And out of that came a very complex empirical vision. But the idea that you could respond to something like a scribbled drawing and then move through the spectrum so art became in the beginning of the 20th century is a very slow evolution. And I can't imagine things changing drastically quickly. I think they'll enlarge, I hope. And I think, you know, one of the great things maybe about artificial intelligence, just in the same way as the plundering of colonial system brought the world together a bit more. Maybe that collaboration will develop, hopefully.
Collaboration is correct.
Yeah.
But before we go on to questions and answers, can we just put a round of applause for our three speakers? I know I have quite a few questions, but I will hand it over to...
Yeah, there's nothing online yet, so anyone in the audience here has a question, please go ahead.
I guess it relates to, I think Eòghann and Cat talking about this question of reclaiming some aspects of your past in order to sort of form an identity. And I'm sort of bringing it down to a rather simple question, which is, it relates to the comment, your description, Kath, about responding to when people ask you where you're from. It's sort of interesting because, you know, I live in a society that's largely grown through immigration, right back to World War II, and then first of all the English, Scots, and Irish, and well before that the Irish, but they mainly came with toes on rings on their toes, as they say. But and then Asian over the last year, and Middle Eastern more recently. This question about where you're from, it's a sort of interesting question, right? Because you take it in one way, but it can be asked in a totally different way, which is a genuine curiosity about that. And it's a very laden question in Australia, right? It's and so when you accept the fact that in a this sort of, and it takes me to the point of, you know, how does somebody, this is there's just lots of thoughts bouncing around listening to you. So I'll try and bring it down to a clean question in a moment. So my wife is Palestinian, right? So I have deep interest in the Middle East, and I will often ask people, you know, where are you from? And what I notice among young people, you know, because if they're wearing the scarf, and like, there'll be a lot of defensiveness. So I'm going to ask a different question. Like, have you ever heard of Farouz, for example? It's a very good question to ask somebody from the Middle East. But I have noticed this defensiveness versus a pride in response. I'm sort of interested in, you know, how you view that and what is the correct thing.
Okay. The Barbados Slave Code was created in 1661.
Right.
So there are two parts to that. Number one, that it was predominantly done that you had to obey every single thing that your slave master did to you and take that on. You couldn't rebel. But part of it was that it's still influencing us today. So if you think about Britain in the 1930s, 40s, Robinson Jam about the Gollywog.
Oh, right, yeah.
The Gollywog is a direct response to the Barbados Slave Code, okay? You then have people who thought there was absolutely nothing wrong with putting on blackface and making themselves as characteristic as possible. Even the literature, I mean, as a little girl, I read probably every Enid Blyton book there was. My grandmother every single night read to me from Uncle Tom's Cabin. I saw myself as like Topsy, the character in Uncle Tom's Cabin. So for me, it wasn't about, oh, there's this person trying to remove a slave. It was like, oh my God, this is how they see us. And me seeing the first Gollywog was like, you know, because I had a massive afro, it was like, oh, this is how people see me. Yeah. And so it comes from that where Black and brown people from the global diaspora are still seeing themselves from under the Barbados Slave Code, 1661, where actually, in respect, this slave code was created because the Governor General then of Barbados was British, used the money because he had interest in plantations, came up to Lewis and built a really big house, right? So nobody talks about that bit. Yeah, they talk about, you know, oh, well, it was done for the good. And so you had anything that was done to you was your own fault. And then you had religion jumped into that as well, literally telling these enslaved people, well, this is what God wants, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't negate the fact that we are still seeing from this code that has done so much harm. So when I come to the bit where it's like, where are you from? I think I can use the artist Lubena Hamid. So she was representing Britain at something and she got asked, where are you from? And she said, oh, I live in England. Right. And the person said to her, no, you don't. And she said, yeah, I do. That's where I came from this morning. Yeah. And the person said, no, where are your grandparents from? She told them, and they said, oh, so you're African, you're from Africa. And she's like, what? No, I grew up here, I live here, my husband's are all the same things. And then she proceeded to make an artwork, which looked like surfboards, but it was this claim of working out where she's from. And when you listen to her in conversation about her, or you listen to like Sonia Boyce, or you listen to the late Sir Jeff Palmer, who I love, when they speak about this aspect of where are you from, it's not of a night, it's not like nice, like, oh, hi, I'm from so-and-so, where are you from? It's literally like, where are you from and why are you here? When are you going back? And so it goes back again to the Windrush generation of them being asked, where are you from? Did you just get off the last banana boat with the images, no Irish, no Scottish, no dogs, no blacks. My grandmother had one of those photos that was sent back from London. And so we are taught, on one hand, it's also about displacement, because we are taught in the Caribbean, still to this day, we're taught, go to Britain, go to America, the streets are paved with gold, you're going to make your money, you're going to come back, you're going to buy a house, it's going to overlook the beach, it's going to be great. No, because the minute you leave the island continues on without you. When I go back to Barbados now, I do not recognize it as the place I grew up. But there's also this aspect of displacement built into that Barbados slave code of you belong to nowhere. You are nothing, you are less than. And so when people now say, well, where are you from? Automatically, if you're a person of color, that is where your brain is going. It's like, oh, this person's telling me I don't belong here, why am I here? And your hackles instantly go up.
Sure, yeah.
So even if you're trying not to, it's still gonna happen. I'm probably married to my husband now because he was never stupid enough to ask me that.
Let's make a joke. I mean, I guess the question is, yeah, thank you very much. And I fully understand that there's different contexts for these things. But I think there's a broader point, and it relates to both Ken's comments about how the English sort of just ignored the Scottish school until people started to establish, and your point about Gaelic. I mean, we have to be able to ask this question in an inclusionary way, not in because it is very important that I know where you're from and what that means. Whether I'm an English.
But what do you have to know?
Well,
Why would you not just know you?
Oh, well, wait a minute. You're assuming it's a personal question, whereas it's we have to know because we have to understand our histories, and we have to learn to. It's interesting being inclusionary means we have to learn from the differences and appreciate them. If we don't ever ask the question, then, in whichever form, I understand, then we never know. So we never know about it. Like Ewan's example of his uncles, who just did not want to know about the Gaelic tradition, right? Because they had to get on. And so if everybody pursued that, then it gets lost. I mean, so my point about we do need to be in building these sort of integrated identities, which I think is a part of the collaboration which we spoke about. I mean, we need to be able to ask these questions and hear them also in an inclusion. Sorry, that's a bit of a lecture.
No, that was really
Sorry
good.
about that.
That was really good.
It's very, it has a lot of meaning for me because it's a constant debate in Australian society. So.
Yeah, I think that there definitely, I personally think that there are other ways that you can maybe ask it.
Yeah.
Where it doesn't make somebody instantly feel like, oh, okay, this is somebody telling me not to be here. Yeah. I definitely think that they're just, I don't know, I think I speak to someone first and try to figure it out before I try to avoid that question at all, because I'm like standing up there like trying to work with your accent, and yeah, I don't.
Displacement is a word that was up there.
Yeah.
And it's difficult to answer the question if you're constantly having a history of displacement, not just people, but economic displacement as well. And mentioning that Scots owners of plantations in the Caribbean and America would displace they would hide their money and bring it back to Scotland to build their
But the thing is, it wasn't for me, it wasn't a Scottish, it was, Lewis was bought by someone who's English.
Right, yeah.
And then he brought in, he actually, and this is why there are canals in Glasgow, because they were created to bring people and goods up to the canals. And so you imagine that somebody's done something so horrific as to create a code that you can be beaten, you can be put in the sun for 12, 15, 24 hours, and then they pour rum on top of you to heal the cut, but not really. And it's for me, it's a lot about divide and conquer, and this was started from the beginning. So again, coming off of slave ships onto Barbados, there's this wall. The wall can't be moved because it's anyone who was very close to dying. They just chucked them in the wall and walked away. But also, if you were lighter skinned, you were put in the houses. If you were darker skinned, you were put in the fields. Then in the houses, when you suffered abuse and you went to the people who were in the fields, they literally said, but it's your own fault. You look like that. And so we still are dealing today again with this idea of divide and conquer. And so it's all these things that kind of play into that idea of displacement, because there are islands in the West Indies that still very much believe that Britannia rule is the rule. And so again, it's like, you're going to go and study, you're going to be a doctor, you're going to be a lawyer, you're going to be this, you're going to be that. But if you look at the Windrush generation as a clear example of that, when they were told we can't find any papers for you, you need to go back when you're 80, some people were 85, 90. And then they're like, I don't know anything. This is my home. I've got my family here. You know, I grew up here, whatever. It's there. That's why, for me, it's such a tragic, because this displacement, these people fought and lived and paid taxes, and also in terms of paying taxes, in terms of displacement, Britain stopped paying the descendants of transatlantic slavery in 2015. I moved here in 2001. That means for 14 years, I've paid tax to people who hurt my ancestors. That's like a complete line. And so I'm trying not to swear, it's very hostile. And so you're then trying to deal with that as well. Like, wait, I paid some of my taxes, went and did what now? So again, it is this, I constantly feel like we're on the back foot. We're never catching up, because there are all these things currently coming up, everything that you research, but you need to research, or else nothing changes.
I think it was in 1835, the British government formed the compensation fund.
Yep.
Which alleviated the economic pressures of owners who then would come back to it. It was,
You know, because they needed that, having made millions already.
yeah, the economic question as well is a big one. Yeah. Any other questions? Just not.
Thank you for that question. That was excellent.
I'll give one for Owen just now. We talked briefly about your time at DJ CAD, something in Jordanson and Dundee, where you studied. And how early on was it when you started to think of art in Gaelic text, thinking of a Gaelic identity? Did you grow up speaking English, grow up speaking Gaelic? You know, at which point did you think, you know what, I need to really focus on looking northwards and westwards?
Yeah, it was probably, I mean, I'm always aware, as I said earlier, I was always aware of that part of my background. But it was like, you know, it was always kind of compartmentalized, and like, as previous generations would say, oh, you don't need to be speaking that, you know, we have that's you don't need that, that's for the village. And you know, and that was a thing. But I think I went to, after I graduated from DG CAD, I went to, as I said, I went to Barcelona, and I lived there, and I made some very dear friends who I'm still close to, from Barcelona and other parts of the world, actually, obviously, because it is a global city. But that really sort of rekindled my interest in wanting to be able to speak the language properly and fully and understand it. And as I say, it's a huge part of my family life in a life context sense. And I was thinking, when I did this Salvation scholarship, I left Scotland and I went to Shetland, and then I went to Faroe, and then I went to Iceland, and I took the Summerall ferry, which I went right round the whole of Iceland and came home. And then I had a second leg, because it was one of these amazing things. And I went to Canada, and I went to Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. And I remember I landed off this Greyhound bus from Halifax to Nova Scotia in this wee town, and I actually got the police. Policeman gave me a lift, because I didn't know it was on the intersection, you know, that way. And I was staying in this bed. Joni McLeod, the lady was called, right? So I knew, and she was obviously Highland heritage herself. It totally was. And so she was laughing. I was the first guest to land at her bed and breakfast out of the police car. But I remember I got to know a few Gaelic speakers in Cairn, and many of them are very well known in the MacColl family, and a lot of musicians. And you very quickly tune into that world, because it's small and you've got an affinity and a connection, you know. So you'd be, you know, and folk would say, just take the truck and go for a run. So I remember one of the first things that two of the Gaelic speakers I met was, they were like, what side were your family on at Culloden? And it's like, what side were you on? And that's, you know, it's a total question, by the way. It's a big leader, because, well, obviously, the fact that didn't win. But you know, and that's a thing, right? It doesn't go away, and you know, that shaped the whole of of so many people's lives. And you know, I think, yeah, but it took, and it's interesting, because you're speaking about how artists often have to leave to really. And then the way up in the car there, I heard the Cahoon and McBride were getting spoken about on Radio Scotland, and they were, you know, they had to leave, and they come from very close to where I live, and that whole thing about everybody having to go somewhere else to be validated. It's such a terribly colonised way to be, isn't it? We have to go somewhere else so that somebody can tell us that we're good at what we do.
So that we can come back.
So we can then come back and go, okay, it's all right now. But that whole thing's so interesting in itself, and yeah, I think what's my wee trading now? But it's such a thing.
It's something you should be proud of, right? You should be proud that you can speak Gaelic because it's your language. You should be proud.
Absolutely, and it's, you know, so my daughter can speak the language really fluently, you know, because we spoke to her since she was born, and so she was at the Gaelic hurley shinty football shinty football matches. I call it football. Where's that coming from? The Shinty Hurley International was played in Inverness yesterday, and she was at that because she works in TV. But it just, that whole thing, I remember as well. Quickly, I'll say this because I'm conscious of time. But they say that the last Gaelic speaker in Ayrshire was born or died the year that Robert Burns was born, and so no, and it was a wee village called Bar, which is kind of a beautiful wee place on the Slincher River. But you know, I just think, you know, I now know that there are young people from Ayrshire who speak Gaelic, with all kinds of backgrounds, by the way, and that's such a wonderful thing, you know, that you can rekindle culture. You can. It's a positive thing, and it's about including everybody and feeling that there's a value and a worth to things. And I think for me, that's what's the most important part of it. You know, it's not about, you know, that's what it is. It just has to be respected, and we have to get to a place where we can respect, you know, all of these things need to be looked after, because it's a colour and it's a thing in the world that needs to be heard and to be supported and to be, you know, respected.
My grandfather was a Gaelic speaker, and I didn't know him that well, but one of my main memories was when we'd have dinner at his house and we'd have to say grace. And I say, well, is it Gaelic or English? And she said, the way the Lord intended. I think that's a tradition, I think, of different islands that do the same thing. They say the same thing, because that international Gaelic English was actually quite an abrasive one.
Yeah,
you know,
enormously so.
My brother and I, our generation, were just observing Gaelic through a window, and rather than actually walking through the door. Yeah,
it's like the othering of yourself, like you're being othered for being who you are. I mean, how can you think yourself that to happen to you? But that's, you know, because we know why, because the power of these things is huge. Yeah. You know,
we've got Anne Redpath featured downstairs in the exhibition, and she's known for, she would only be able to paint Scotland when she was in the near the Mediterranean, down south of France and Spain. And when she came back to Edinburgh, then she could think about painting Mediterranean. I think, you know, there was that, you're talking about how it's when you get out of where you're from, you can really think about the place in that more pride or more clarity. Yeah. Any more questions just now?
We've got two online. I can ask, this one's probably really connected. So the exhibition brings together many Scottish artworks, but which artwork other than your own speaks to you the most? And that can be to anybody.
Oh, I
Answer that. We'll say that.
I respond to William Gillis, not because of the painting, really, because I knew the man, and he was a very quiet, unassuming guy. He was head of painting when I was a student, and unlike art schools nowadays, he wasn't locked in an office doing administration. He was wandering around the studios talking to students, and you know, he would do very mundane things that you suddenly realize are ingrained in you. So he'd come along and he'd put his hand on your back and he'd say, step back a bit. And so you'd step back a bit and you looking at it and looking and waiting for some words of wisdom. He said, you see it better, don't you? And you think, but that sounds, you know, so trite. And yet all of us who make things, we recognize that we're working up close to it and step back. And I mean, it's the same thing if I listen to a writer or a dancer talking, they're always talking about the sense of the distance you need to have from something. You're engaged in it, and then you step back and you see it. You see the totality of it. And so I think of Gillis, and I think of Gillis in a weird way, in the sense that I enjoyed my education at art school. I enjoyed going to the National Gallery and seeing the Rembrandts and the Poussins and so on. But I always thought it was absolutely incredible that we had such a limited history that we were taught. We were given Renaissance and 19th century French painting. That was it. We got a very good architectural course in first year, covering modernism or running back, making contrasts to Romanesque, Gothic. That was the only place that was done, that kind of minimum. I think that in a way, not only was, we were talking about the Jacobites, which side were you on? A fascinating thing that same chap I was mentioning, Murray Pittock's history, was saying that he'd been going over the still existing logbook records of the Jacobite regiments, particularly the Jacobite Highland regiments. And he's saying, in the history we're taught, it was a division of Highlanders and Lowlanders. It was a division of Presbyterians and Catholics. And yet when he goes through the books, he discovers that the Highland regiments fighting on the Jacobite side were predominantly Presbyterians, Episcopalians, and that again, something I'd never known much about, that the Episcopalians after the war were incredibly closed down. No more than 9 of them were allowed to gather in one place, just in case it would be sedition was being fermented again. And anyway, that what I felt with, if I was thinking about Gillis, was just the gentleness and openness of him as a human being, that he wanted other people to find themselves.
It's the greatest compliment you give. It's got a very personal work.
Yeah.
It's the greatest compliment you give to your to the students. Individuality and expression were key to his work, and do you feel that came through in the students? Not other questions.
There's another question which is a bit broad, and I'll open it up to anyone again. Wendy's wondering what makes home home, and then what makes that home yours. I guess maybe from an artistic perspective, what is your artistic home?
My artistic home as a curator's archives. The archives hold a lot of information from where they're from. Again, the fact that I can see something and I can see it differently because it's used as one thing, either in the Caribbean or any of the places that I've lived when I speak to the Indigenous communities, compared to what it's done in that moment in time, and therefore it can change the narrative or give a different narrative to what it is. So from an art, a researcher, academic, curatorial perspective, it's always going to be the archives. I spend a lot of time in archives digging around and asking, why is this label like this? And this is not right. And, here's research for this. And I also spent a lot of time in the archives and libraries. There are lots of back editions of certain things because I'm trying to dig for circles. So either I'm in archives in Scotland, at the moment I'm in archives in the Highlands a lot, or I'm in archives at either the University of the West Indies or the Barbados Museum. It's always going to be archives for me. It starts with archives, and then it's also, once I have the idea of archives in my head, then I go and speak to lots and lots of people and artists and have round tables and show them the work that we're doing. And then, we all get together, and then from that comes the idea. So again, my practice is very collaborative with the artists. The artists and the archive material are really, really important.
Thank you. A lot of questions online. If there's any more in the room.
Any questions here? I think we've got, I think we're actually very good for time. I think we can wrap it up there. Thank you very much. This has been a fascinating conversation. I think 3 very different perspectives in the best way possible. I think indicative and representative of the exhibition we have and the Boswell collection of contemporary art we have downstairs. So if you haven't seen it, don't worry, it's up until the 15th of February, you've got tons of time. And as we say, this is marks the first of many events we've got going on throughout the course of the exhibition. So one more time, big thank you for your and enjoy the rest of your weekend. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.